Do you really think the world around you is perfectly safe? Perhaps the person right next to you is hiding a dark truth. New Moon on our channel, we uncover bone-chilling crimes and psychological thrillers that you've never heard before. To dive into the depths of mystery, subscribe now, and if you enjoy the video, stay with us by leaving a like. Remember, the truth isn't always right in front of your eyes.
Chapter 2, Part 1. New Land. The first day of the new year, January 1st, 1915, was cloudy, with a gentle northerly breeze and occasional snow squalls. The condition of the pack improved in the evening, and after 8 p.m. we forged ahead rapidly through the brittle young ice, easily broken by the ship. A few hours later a moderate gale came up from the east with continuous snow. After 4 a.m. on the 2nd, we got into thick, old pack ice, showing signs of heavy pressure. It was much hummocked, but large areas of open water and long leads to the southwest continued until noon. The position then was latitude 69 degrees 49 minutes south, longitude 15 degrees 42 minutes west, and the run for the 24 hours had been 124 miles south, 3 degrees west. This was cheering. The heavy pack blocked the way south after midday. It would have been almost impossible to have pushed the ship into the ice, and in any case the gale would have made such a proceeding highly dangerous. So we dodged along to the west and north, looking for a suitable opening towards the south. The good run had given me hope of sighting the land on the following day, and the delay was annoying. I was growing anxious to reach land on account of the dogs, which had not been able to get exercise for 4 weeks, and were becoming run down. We passed at least 200 bergs during the day, and we noticed also large masses of hummocky bay ice and ice-foot. One floe of bay ice had black earth upon it, apparently basaltic in origin, and there was a large berg with a broad band of yellowish-brown right through it. The stain may have been volcanic dust. Many of the bergs had quaint shapes. There was one that exactly resembled a large two-funnelled liner, complete in silhouette except for smoke. Later in the day we found an opening in the pack and made 9 miles to the southwest, but at 2 a.m. on January 3rd the lead ended in hummocky ice, impossible to penetrate. A moderate easterly gale had come up with snow squalls, and we could not get a clear view in any direction. The hummocky ice did not offer suitable anchorage for the ship, and we were compelled to dodge up and down for 10 hours before we were able to make fast to a small floe under the lee of a berg 120 feet high. The berg broke the wind and saved us, drifting fast to leeward. The position was latitude 69 degrees 59 minutes south, longitude 17 degrees 31 minutes west. We made a move again at 7 p.m., when we took in the ice anchor and proceeded south, and at 10 p.m. we passed a small berg that the ship had nearly touched 12 hours previously. Obviously we were not making much headway. Several of the bergs passed during this day were of solid blue ice, indicating true glacier origin. By midnight of the 3rd we had made 11 miles to the south, and then came to a full stop in weather so thick with snow that we could not learn if the leads and lanes were worth entering. The ice was hummocky, but fortunately the gale was decreasing, and after we had scanned all the leads and pools within our reach we turned back to the northeast. 2 sperm and 2 large blue whales were sighted. The first we had seen for 260 miles. We also saw petrels, numerous adelies, emperors, crab-eaters, and sea leopards. The clearer weather of the morning showed us that the pack was solid and impassable from the southeast to the southwest, and at 10 a.m. on the 4th we again passed within 5 yards of the small berg that we had passed twice on the previous day. We had been steaming and dodging about for over an area of 20 square miles for 50 hours, trying to find an opening to the south, southeast, or southwest, but all the leads ran north, northeast, or northwest. It was as though the spirits of the Antarctic were pointing us to the backward track, the track we were determined not to follow. Our desire was to make easting as well as southing so as to reach the land if possible, east of Ross's furthest south, and well east of Coates Land. This was more important as the prevailing winds appeared to be easterly, and every mile of easting would count. In the afternoon we went west in some open water, and by 4 p.m. we were making west-southwest, with more water opening up ahead. The sun was shining brightly, over 3 degrees high at midnight, and we were able to maintain this direction in fine weather till the following noon. The position then was latitude 70 degrees 28 minutes south, longitude 20 degrees 16 minutes west, and the run had been 62 miles south, 62 degrees west. At 8 a.m. there had been open water from north round by west to southwest, but impenetrable pack to the south and east. At 3 p.m. the way to the southwest and west-northwest was absolutely blocked, and as we experienced a set to the west, I did not feel justified in burning more of the reduced stock of coal to go west or north. I took the ship back over our course for 4 miles, to a point where some looser pack gave faint promise of a way through. But after battling for 3 hours with very heavy hummocked ice, and making 4 miles to the south, we were brought up by the huge blocks and floes of very old pack. Further effort seemed useless at that time, and I gave the order to bank fires after we had moored the Endurance to a solid floe. The weather was clear, and some enthusiastic football players had a game on the floe until about midnight. Worsley dropped through a hole in rotten ice while retrieving the ball. He had to be retrieved himself. Solid pack still barred the way to the south on the following morning, January 6th. There was some open water north of the floe, but as the day was calm and I did not wish to use coal in a possibly vain search for an opening to the southward, I kept the ship moored to the floe. This pause in good weather gave an opportunity to exercise the dogs, which were taken onto the floe by the men in charge of them. The excitement of the animals was intense. Several managed to get into the water, and the muzzles they were wearing did not prevent some hot fights. 2 dogs, which had contrived to slip their muzzles, fought themselves into an icy pool, and were hauled out still locked in a grapple. However, men and dogs enjoyed the exercise. A sounding gave a depth of 2,400 fathoms, with a blue mud bottom. The wind freshened from the west early in the morning, and we started to skirt the northern edge of the solid pack in an easterly direction under the sail. We had cleared the close pack by noon, but the outlook to the south gave small promise of useful progress, and I was anxious now to make easting. We went northeast under sail, and after making 39 miles, passed a peculiar berg that we had been abreast of 60 hours earlier. Killer whales were becoming active around us, and I had to exercise caution in allowing anyone to leave the ship. These beasts have a habit of locating a resting seal by looking over the edge of a floe, and then striking through the ice from below in search of a meal. They would not distinguish between seal and man. The noon position on January 8th was latitude 70 degrees 0 minutes south, longitude 19 degrees 9 minutes west. We had made 66 miles in a northeasterly direction during the preceding 24 hours. The course during the afternoon was east-southeast, through loose pack and open water, with deep hummocky floes to the south. Several leads to the south came in view, but we held on the easterly course. The floes were becoming looser, and there were indications of open water ahead. The ship passed not fewer than 500 bergs that day, some of them very large. A dark water sky extended from east to south-southeast on the following morning, and the Endurance, working through loose pack at half speed, reached open water just before noon. A rampart berg 150 feet high and a quarter of a mile long lay at the edge of the loose pack, and we sailed over a projecting foot of this berg into rolling ocean stretching to the horizon. The sea extended from a little to the west of south, round by east to north-northeast, and its welcome promise was supported by a deep water sky to the south. I laid a course south by east in an endeavour to get south and east of Ross's furthest south, latitude 71 degrees 30 minutes south. We kept the open water for 100 miles, passing many bergs, but encountering no pack. 2 very large whales, probably blue whales, came up close to the ship, and we saw spouts in all directions. Open water inside the pack in that latitude might have the appeal of sanctuary to the whales, which are harried by man further north. The run southward in blue water, with a path cleared ahead and the miles falling away behind us, was a joyful experience after the long struggle through the ice lanes. But, like other good things, our spell of free movement had to end. The Endurance encountered the ice again at 1 a.m. on the 10th. Loose pack stretched to east and south, with open water to the west and a good water sky. It consisted partly of heavy, hummocky ice, showing evidence of great pressure, but contained also many thick, flat floes, evidently formed in some sheltered bay and never subjected to pressure or to much motion. The swirl of the ship's wash brought diatomaceous scum from the sides of this ice. The water became thick with diatoms at 9 a.m., and I ordered a cast to be made. No bottom was found at 210 fathoms. The Endurance continued to advance southward through loose pack that morning. We saw the spouts of numerous whales, and noticed some hundreds of crab-eaters lying on the floes. White-rumped terns, Antarctic petrels, and snow petrels were numerous, and there was a colony of adelies on a low berg. A few killer whales with their characteristic high dorsal fin also came in view. The noon position was latitude 72 degrees 2 minutes south, longitude 16 degrees 7 minutes west, and the run for the 24 hours had been 136 miles south, 6 degrees east. We were now in the vicinity of the land discovered by Dr. W.S. Bruce, leader of the Scotia expedition in 1904, and named by him Coates Land. Dr. Bruce encountered an ice barrier in latitude 72 degrees 18 minutes south, longitude 10 degrees west, stretching from the northeast to southwest. He followed the barrier edge to the southwest for 150 miles, and reached latitude 74 degrees 1 minute south, longitude 22 degrees west. He saw no naked rock, but his description of rising slopes of snow and ice, with shoaling water off the barrier wall, indicated clearly the presence of land. It was up those slopes, at a point as far south as possible, that I planned to begin the march across the Antarctic continent. All hands were watching now for the coast described by Dr. Bruce, and at 5 p.m. the lookout reported an appearance of land to the south-southeast. We could see a gentle snow slope rising to a height of about 1,000 feet. It seemed to be an island or a peninsula with the Sound on its south side, and the position of its most northerly point was about 72 degrees 34 minutes south, 16 degrees 40 minutes west. The Endurance was passing through heavy loose pack, and shortly before midnight she broke into a lead of open sea along a barrier edge. A sounding within 1 cable's length of the barrier edge gave no bottom with 210 fathoms of line. The barrier was 70 feet high, with cliffs of about 40 feet. The Scotia must have passed this point when pushing to Bruce's farthest south on March 6, 1904, and I knew from the narrative of that voyage, as well as from our own observation, that the coast trended away to the southwest. The lead of open water continued along the barrier edge, and we pushed forward without delay. An easterly breeze brought clouds and falls of snow during the morning of January 11th. The barrier trended southwest by south, and we skirted it for 50 miles until 11 a.m. The cliffs in the morning were 20 feet high, and by noon they had increased to 110 and 115 feet. The brow apparently rose 20 to 30 feet higher. We were forced away from the barrier once for 3 hours by a line of very heavy pack ice. Otherwise there is open water along the edge, with high loose pack to the west and northwest. We noticed a seal bobbing up and down in an apparent effort to swallow a long, silvery fish that projected at least 18 inches from its mouth. The noon position was latitude 73 degrees 13 minutes south, longitude 20 degrees 43 minutes west, and a sounding then gave 155 fathoms at a distance of a mile from the barrier. The bottom consisted of large igneous pebbles. The weather then became thick, and I held away to the westward, where the sky had given indications of open water, until 7 p.m., when we laid the ship alongside in a floe in loose pack. Heavy snow was falling, and I was anxious lest the westerly wind should bring the pack hard against the coast and jam the ship. The Nimrod had a narrow escape from a misadventure of this kind in the Ross Sea early in 1908. We made a start again at 5 a.m. the next morning, January 12th, in overcast weather with mist and snow showers, and 4 hours later broke through loose pack ice into open water. The view was obscured, but we proceeded to the southeast, and had gained 24 miles by noon, when 3 soundings in latitude 74 degrees 4 minutes south, longitude 22 degrees 48 minutes west, gave 95, 128, and 103 fathoms, with a bottom of sand, pebbles, and mud. Clark got a good haul of biological specimens in the dredge. The Endurance was now close to what appeared to be the barrier, with a heavy pack ice foot containing numerous bergs frozen in and possibly aground. The solid ice turned away towards the northwest, and we followed the ice for 48 miles north, 60 degrees west, to clear it. Now we were beyond the point reached by the Scotia, and the land underlying the ice sheet we were skirting was new. The northerly trend was unexpected, and I began to suspect that we were really rounding a huge ice tongue attached to the true barrier edge and extending northward. Events confirmed this suspicion. We skirted the pack all night, steering northwest, then west by north till 4 a.m., and round to the southwest. The course at 8 a.m. on the 13th was south-southwest. The barrier at midnight was low and distant, and at 8 a.m. there was merely a narrow ice foot about 200 yards across, separating it from the open water. By noon there was only an occasional shelf of ice foot. The barrier in one place came with an easy sweep to the sea. We could have landed stores there without difficulty. We made a sounding 400 feet off the barrier, but got no bottom at 676 fathoms. At 4 p.m., still following the barrier to the southwest, we reached a corner and found it receding abruptly to the southeast. Our way was blocked by very heavy pack, and after spending 2 hours in vain searching for an opening, we moored the Endurance to a floe and banked fires. During that day we passed 2 schools of seals, swimming fast to the northwest and north-northeast. The animals swam in close order, rising and blowing like porpoises, and we wondered if there was any significance in their journey northward at that time of the year. Several young emperor penguins had been captured and brought aboard on the previous day. 2 of them were still alive when the Endurance was brought along the ice floe. They promptly hopped onto the ice, turned round, bowed gracefully 3 times, and retired to the far side of the floe. There is something curiously human about the manners and movements of these birds. I was concerned about the dogs. They were losing condition, and some of them appeared to be ailing. One dog had to be shot on the 12th. We did not move the ship on the 14th. A breeze came from the east in the evening, and under its influence the pack began to work offshore. Before midnight the close ice that had barred our way had opened, and left a lane along the foot of the barrier. I decided to wait for the morning, not wishing to risk getting caught between the barrier and the pack in the event of the wind changing. A sounding gave 1,357 fathoms, with a bottom of glacial mud. The noon observation showed the position to be latitude 74 degrees 9 minutes south, longitude 27 degrees 16 minutes west. We cast off at 6 a.m. on the 15th in hazy weather with a northeasterly breeze, and proceeded along the barrier in open water. The course was southeast for 16 miles, then south-southeast. We now had solid pack to windward, and at 3 p.m. we passed a bight probably 10 miles deep and running to the northeast. A similar bight appeared at 6 p.m. These deep cuts strengthened the impression we had already formed that for several days we had been rounding a great mass of ice, at least 50 miles across, stretching out from the coast and possibly destined to float away at some time in the future. The soundings, roughly 200 fathoms at the landward side and 1,300 fathoms at the seaward side, suggested that this mighty projection was afloat. Seals were plentiful. We saw large numbers on the pack, and several on low parts of the barrier, where the slope was easy. The ship passed through large schools of seals swimming from the barrier to the pack offshore. The animals were splashing and blowing around the Endurance, and Hurley made a record of this unusual sight with a kinematograph camera. The barrier now stretched to the southwest again. Sail was set to a fresh easterly breeze, but at 7 p.m. it had to be furled, the Endurance being held up by pack ice against the barrier for an hour. We took advantage of the pause to sound and got 268 fathoms with glacial mud and pebbles. Then a small lane appeared ahead. We pushed through at full speed, and by 8:30 p.m. the Endurance was moving southward with sails set in a fine expanse of open water. We continued to skirt the barrier in clear weather. I was watching for possible landing places, though, as a matter of fact, I had no intention of landing north of Vachel Bay, in Luitpold Land, except under pressure of necessity. Every mile gained towards the south meant a mile less sledging when the time came for the overland journey. Shortly before midnight on the 15th, we came abreast of the northern edge of a great glacier or overflow from the inland ice, projecting beyond the barrier into the sea. It was 400 or 500 feet high, and at its edge was a large mass of thick bay ice. The bay formed by the northern edge of this glacier would have made an excellent landing place. A flat ice foot, nearly 3 feet above sea level, looked like a natural quay. From this ice foot a snow slope rose to the top of the barrier. The bay was protected from the southeasterly wind, and was open only to the northerly wind, which is rare in those latitudes. A sounding gave 80 fathoms, indicating that the glacier was aground. I named the place Glacier Bay, and had reason later to remember it with regret. The Endurance steamed along the front of this ice floe for about 17 miles. The glacier showed huge crevices and high pressure ridges, and appeared to run back to ice-covered slopes or hills 1,000 or 2,000 feet high. Some bays in its front were filled with smooth ice, dotted with seals and penguins. At 4 a.m. on the 16th, we reached the edge of another huge glacial overflow from the ice sheet. The ice appeared to be coming over low hills and was heavily broken. The cliff face was 250 to 350 feet high, and the ice surface 2 miles inland was probably 2,000 feet high. The cliff front showed a tide mark of about 6 feet, proving that it was not afloat. We steamed along the front of this tremendous glacier for 40 miles, and then, at 8:30 a.m., we were held up by solid pack ice, which appeared to be held by stranded bergs. The depth 2 cables off the barrier cliff was 134 fathoms. No further advance was possible that day, but the noon observation, which gave the position as latitude 76·27" south, longitude 28°51' west, showed that we had gained 124 miles to the southwest during the preceding 24 hours. The afternoon was not without incident. The bergs in the neighbourhood were very large, several being over 200 feet high, and some of them were firmly aground, showing tide marks. A barrier berg bearing northwest appeared to be about 25 miles long. We pushed the ship against a small banded berg, from which Wordie secured several large lumps of biotite granite. While the Endurance was being held slow ahead against the berg, a loud crack was heard, and the geologists had to scramble aboard at once. The bands on this berg were particularly well defined. They were due to morainic action in the parent glacier. Later in the day the easterly wind increased to a gale. Fragments of floe drifted past at about 2 knots, and the pack to leeward began to break up fast. A low berg of shallow draught drove down into the grinding pack, and, smashing against 2 larger stranded bergs, pushed them off the bank. The 3 went away, together pell-mell. We took shelter under the lee of a large stranded berg. End of Chapter 2, Part 1. Chapter 2, Part 2 of South. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. South, the story of Shackleton's last expedition, 1914 to 1917, by Sir Ernest Shackleton, Chapter 2, Part 2, New Land. A blizzard from the east-northeast prevented us leaving the shelter of the berg on the following day, Sunday, January 17th. The weather was clear, but the gale drove dense clouds of snow off the land and obscured the coastline most of the time. The land, seen when the air is clear, appears higher than we thought it yesterday. Probably it rises to 3,000 feet above the head of the glacier. Caird Coast, as I have named it, connects Coates Land, discovered by Bruce in 1904, with Luitpold Land, discovered by Filchner in 1912. The northern part is similar in character to Coates Land. It is fronted by an undulating barrier, the van of a mighty ice sheet that is being forced outward from the high interior of the Antarctic continent, and apparently is sweeping over low hills, plains, and shallow seas, as the great Arctic ice sheet once pressed over northern Europe. The barrier surface, seen from the sea, is of a faint golden-brown colour. It terminates usually in cliffs ranging from 10 to 300 feet in height, but in a very few places sweeps down level with the sea. The cliffs are of a dazzling whiteness, with wonderful blue shadows. Far inland, higher slopes can be seen, appearing like dim blue or faint golden fleecy clouds. These distant slopes have increased in nearness and clearness as we have come to the southwest, while the barrier cliffs here are higher and apparently firmer. We are now close to the junction with Luitpold Land. At this southern end of the Caird Coast, the ice sheet, undulating over the hidden and imprisoned land, is bursting down a steep slope in tremendous glaciers, bristling with ridges and spikes of ice, and seamed by thousands of crevices. Along the whole length of the coast we have seen no bare land or rock. Not as much as a solitary nunatak has appeared to relieve the surface of ice and snow. But the upward sweep of the ice slopes towards the horizon and the ridges, terraces, and crevices that appear as the ice approaches the sea tell of the hills and valleys that lie below. The Endurance lay under the lee of the stranded berg until 7 a.m. on January 18th. The gale had moderated by that time, and we proceeded under sail to the southwest through a lane that had opened along the glacier front. We skirted the glacier till 9:30 a.m., when it ended in 2 bays, open to the northwest, but sheltered by stranded bergs to the west. The coast beyond trended south-southwest with a gentle land slope. The pack now forces us to go west 14 miles, when we break through a long line of heavy brash mixed with large lumps and growlers. We do this under the fore topsail only, the engines being stopped to protect the propeller. This takes us into open water, where we make south 50 degrees west for 24 miles. Then we again encounter pack, which forces us to the northwest for 10 miles, when we are brought up by heavy snow lumps, brash, and large, loose floes. The character of the pack shows change. The floes are very thick and are covered by deep snow. The brash between the floes is so thick and heavy that we cannot push through without great expenditure of power, and then for a short distance only. We therefore lie to for a while to see if the pack opens at all when this northeast wind ceases. Our position on the morning of the 19th was latitude 76 degrees 34 minutes south, longitude 31 degrees 30 minutes west. The weather was good, but no advance could be made. The ice had closed around the ship during the night, and no water could be seen in any direction from the deck. A few lanes were in sight from the masthead. We sounded in 312 fathoms, finding mud, sand, and pebbles. The land showed faintly to the east. We waited for the conditions to improve, and the scientists took the opportunity to dredge for biological and geological specimens. During the night a moderate northeasterly gale sprang up, and a survey of the position on the 20th showed that the ship was firmly beset. The ice was packed heavily and firmly all round the Endurance, in every direction as far as the eye could reach from the masthead. There was nothing to be done till the conditions changed, and we waited through that day and the succeeding days with increased anxiety. The east-northeasterly gale that had forced us to take shelter behind the stranded berg on the 16th had veered later to the northeast, and it continued with varying intensity until the 22nd. Apparently this wind had crowded the ice into the bight of the Weddell Sea, and the ship was now drifting southwest with the floes which had enclosed it. A slight movement of the ice round the ship caused the rudder to become dangerously jammed on the 21st, and we had to cut away the ice with ice chisels, heavy pieces of iron with 6-foot wooden halves. We kept steam up in readiness for a move if the opportunity offered, and the engines running full speed ahead helped to clear the rudder. Land was in sight to the east and south, about 16 miles distant on the 22nd. The land ice seemed to be faced with ice cliffs at most points, but here and there slopes ran down to sea level. Large creviced areas in terraces parallel with the coast showed where the ice was moving down over foothills. The inland ice appeared for the most part to be undulating, smooth, and easy to march over, but many crevices might have been concealed from us by the surface snow or by the absence of shadows. I thought that the land probably rose to a height of 5,000 feet, 40 or 50 miles inland. The accurate estimation of heights and distances in the Antarctic is always difficult, owing to the clear air, the confusing monotony of colouring, and the deceptive effect of mirage and refraction. The land appeared to increase in height to the southward, where we saw a line of land or barrier that must have been 70 miles, and possibly was even more distant. Sunday, January 24th, was a clear sunny day, with gentle easterly and southerly breezes. No open water could be seen from the masthead, but there was a slight water sky to the west and northwest. This is the first time for 10 days that the wind had varied from northeast and east, and on 5 of these days it had risen to a gale. Evidently the ice has become firmly packed in this quarter, and we must wait patiently till a southerly gale occurs, or currents open the ice. We are drifting slowly. The position today was 76 degrees 49 minutes south, 33 degrees 51 minutes west. Worsley and James, working on the floe with a Q magnometer, found the variation to be 6 degrees west. Just before midnight a crack developed in the ice 5 yards wide and a mile long, 50 yards ahead of the ship. The crack had widened to a quarter of a mile by 10 a.m. on the 25th, and for 3 hours we tried to force the ship into this opening, with engines at full speed ahead and all sails set. The sole effect was to wash some ice away astern and clear the rudder, and after convincing myself that the ship was firmly held, I abandoned the attempt. Later in the day, Crean and 2 of my other men were over the side on a stage, chipping at a large piece of ice that had got under the ship, and appeared to be impeding her movement. The ice broke away suddenly, shot up and overturned, pinning Crean between the stage and the haft of the heavy 11-foot iron pincer. He was in danger for a few moments, but we got him clear, suffering merely from a few bad bruises. The thick iron bar had been bent against him to an angle of 45 degrees. The days that followed were uneventful. Moderate breezes from the south and southwest had no apparent effect upon the ice, and the ship remained firmly held. On the 27th, the 10th day of inactivity, I decided to let the fires out. We had been burning half a ton of coal a day to keep steam in the boilers, and as the bunkers now contained only 67 tons, representing 33 days' steaming, we could not afford to continue this expenditure of fuel. Land still showed to the east and south when the horizon was clear. The biologist was securing some interesting specimens with the hand dredge at various depths. A sounding on the 26th gave 360 fathoms, and another on the 29th, 449 fathoms. The drift was to the west, and an observation on the 31st, Sunday, showed that the ship had made 8 miles during the week. James and Hudson rigged the wireless in the hope of hearing the monthly message from the Falkland Islands. This message would be due about 3:20 a.m. on the following morning, but James was doubtful about hearing anything with our small apparatus at a distance of 1,630 miles from the dispatching station. We heard nothing, as a matter of fact, and later efforts were similarly unsuccessful. The conditions would have been difficult even for a station of high power. We were accumulating gradually a stock of seal meat during these days of waiting. Fresh meat for the dogs was needed, and seal steaks and liver made a very welcome change from the ship's rations aboard the Endurance. 4 crab-eaters and 3 Weddells, over a ton of meat for dog and man, fell to our guns on February 2nd, and all hands were occupied most of the day getting the carcasses back to the ship over the rough ice. We rigged 3 sledges for man-haulage, and brought the seals about 2 miles, the sledging parties being guided among the ridges and pools by semaphore from the crow's nest. 2 more seals were sighted on the far side of a big pool, but I did not allow them to be pursued. Some of the ice was in a treacherous condition, with thin films hiding cracks and pools, and I did not wish to risk an accident. A crack about 4 miles long opened in the floe to the stern of the ship on the 3rd. The narrow lane in front was still open, but the prevailing light breezes did not seem likely to produce any useful movement in the ice. Early on the morning of the 5th, a northeasterly gale sprang up, bringing overcast skies and thick snow. Soon the pack was opening and closing without much loosening effect. At noon the ship gave a sudden start and heeled over 3 degrees. Immediately afterwards a crack ran from the bows to the lead ahead and another to the lead astern. I thought it might be possible to reeve the ship through one of these leads towards open water. But we could see no water through the thick snow, and before steam was raised, and while the view was still obscured, the pack closed again. The northerly gale had given place to light westerly breezes on the 6th. The pack seemed to be more solid than ever. It stretched almost unbroken to the horizon in every direction, and the situation was made worse by very low temperatures in succeeding days. The temperature was down to 0 on the night of the 7th, and was 2 degrees below 0 on the 8th. This cold spell in midsummer was most unfortunate from our point of view, since it cemented the pack and tightened the grip of the ice upon the ship. The slow drift to the southwest continued, and we caught occasional glimpses of distant uplands on the eastern horizon. The position on the 7th was latitude 76 degrees 57 minutes south, longitude 35 degrees 7 minutes west. Soundings on the 6th and 8th found glacial mud at 630 and 529 fathoms. The Endurance was lying in a pool covered by young ice on the 9th. The solid floes had loosened the grip on the ship itself, but they were packed tightly all around. The weather was foggy. We felt a slight northerly swell coming through the pack, and the movement gave rise to hope that there was open water near to us. At 11 a.m. a long crack developed in the pack, running east and west as far as we could see through the fog, and I ordered steam to be raised in the hope of being able to break away into this lead. The effort failed. We could break the young ice in the pool, but the pack defied us. The attempt was renewed on the 11th, a fine clear day with blue sky. The temperature was still low, 2 degrees Fahrenheit at midnight. After breaking through some young ice, the Endurance became jammed against soft floe. The engines, running full speed astern, produced no effect until all hands joined in sallying ship. The dog kennels amidship made it necessary for the people to gather aft, where they rushed from side to side in a mass in the confined space around the wheel. This was a ludicrous affair, the men falling over one another amid shouts of laughter, without producing much effect on the ship. She remained fast, while all hands jumped at the word of command, but finally slid off when the men were stamping hard at the double. We were now in a position to take advantage of any opening that might appear. The ice was firm around us, and as there seemed small chance of making a move that day, I had the motor crawler and warper put out on the floe for a trial run. The motor worked most successfully, running at about 6 miles an hour over slabs and ridges of ice, hidden by a foot or two of soft snow. The surface was worse than we would expect to face on land or barrier ice. The motor warped itself back on a 500-fathom steel wire and was taking aboard again. From the masthead, the mirage is continually giving us false alarms. Everything wears an aspect of unreality. Icebergs hang upside down in the sky. The land appears as layers of silvery or golden cloud. Cloud banks look like land. Icebergs masquerade as islands or nunataks, and the distant barrier to the south is thrown into view, although it is really outside our range of vision. Worst of all is the deceptive appearance of open water, caused by the refraction of distant water or by the sun shining at an angle on the field of smooth snow or the face of ice cliffs below the horizon. The second half of February produced no important change in our situation. Early in the morning of the 14th, I ordered a good head of steam on the engines and sent all hands onto the floe with ice chisels, prickers, saws, and picks. We worked all day and throughout most of the next day in a strenuous effort to get the ship into the lead ahead. The men cut away the young ice before the bows and pulled it aside with great energy. After 24 hours' labour, we had got the ship a third of the way to the lead. But about 400 yards of heavy ice, including old rafted pack, still separated the Endurance from the water, and reluctantly I had to admit that further effort was useless. Every opening we made froze up again quickly owing to the unseasonably low temperature. The young ice was elastic and prevented the ship delivering a strong, splitting blow to the floe, while at the same time it held the older ice against any movement. The abandonment of the attack was a great disappointment to all hands. The men had worked long hours without thought of rest, and they deserved success. But the task was beyond our powers. I had not abandoned hope of getting clear, but was counting now on the possibility of having to spend a winter in the inhospitable arms of the pack. The sun, which had been above the horizon for 2 months, set at midnight on the 17th, and although it would not disappear until April, its slanting rays warned us of the approach of winter. Pools and leads appeared occasionally, but they froze over very quickly. We continued to accumulate a supply of seal meat and blubber, and the excursions across the floes to shoot and bring in the seals provided welcome exercise for all hands. 3 crab-eater cows, shot on the 21st, were not accompanied by a bull, and blood was to be seen about the hole from which they had crawled. We surmised that the bull had become the prey of one of the killer whales. These aggressive creatures were to be seen often in the lanes and pools, and we were always distrustful of their ability or willingness to discriminate between seal and man. A lizard-like head would show while the killer gazed along the floe with wicked eyes. Then the brute would dive, to come up a few moments later, perhaps under some unfortunate seal reposing on the ice. Worsley examined a spot where a killer had smashed a hole 8 feet by 12 feet in 12½ inches of hard ice, covered by 2½ inches of snow. Big blocks of ice had been tossed onto the floe surface. Wordy, engaged in measuring the thickness of young ice, went through to his waist one day just as a killer rose to blow in the adjacent lead. His companions pulled him out hurriedly. On the 22nd, the Endurance reached the furthest south point of her drift, touching the 77th parallel of latitude in longitude 35 degrees west. The summer had gone. Indeed, the summer had scarcely been with us at all. The temperatures were low day and night, and the pack was freezing solidly around the ship. The thermometer recorded 10 degrees below zero Fahrenheit at 2 a.m. on the 22nd. Some hours earlier we had watched a wonderful golden mist to the southward, where the rays of the declining sun shone through vapor rising from the ice. All normal standards of perspective vanish under such conditions, and the low ridges of the pack, with mist lying between them, gave the illusion of a wilderness of mountain peaks like the Bernese Oberland. I could not doubt now that the Endurance was confined for the winter. Gentle breezes from the east, south, and southwest did not disturb the hardening floes. The seals were disappearing, and the birds were leaving us. The land showed still in fair weather on the distant horizon, but it was beyond our reach now, and regrets for havens that lay behind us were vain. We must wait for the spring, which may bring us better fortune. If I had guessed a month ago that the ice would grip us here, I would have established our base at one of the landing places at the Great Glacier. But there seemed no reason to anticipate then that the fates would prove unkind. This calm weather with intense cold in a summer month is surely exceptional. My chief anxiety is the drift. Where will the vagrant winds and currents carry the ship during the long winter months that are ahead of us? We will go west, no doubt, but how far? And will it be possible to break out of the pack early in spring and reach Vachel Bay, or some other suitable landing place? These are momentous questions for us. On February 24th, we ceased to observe the ship routine, and the Endurance became a winter station. All hands were on duty during the day and slept at night, except a watchman who looked after the dogs and watched for any sign of movement in the ice. We cleared a space of 10 feet by 20 feet round the rudder and propeller, sawing through ice 2 feet thick and lifting the blocks with a pair of tongs made by the carpenter. Crean used the blocks to make an ice house for the dog, Sally, which had added a litter of pups to the strength of the expedition. Seals appeared occasionally, and we killed all that came within our reach. They represented fuel as well as food for men and dogs. Orders were given for the afterhold to be cleared and the stores checked, so that we might know exactly how we stood for a siege by an Antarctic winter. The dogs went off the ship the following day. Their kennels were placed on the floe along the length of a wire rope to which the leashes were fastened. The dogs seemed heartily glad to leave the ship, and yelped loudly and joyously as they were moved to their new quarters. We had begun the training of teams, and already there was keen rivalry between the drivers. The flat floes and frozen leads in the neighbourhood of the ship made excellent training grounds. Hockey and football on the floe were our chief recreations, and all hands joined in many a strenuous game. Worsley took a party to the floe on the 26th, and started building a line of igloos and dogloos round the ship. These little buildings were constructed Eskimo fashion of big blocks of ice, with thin sheets for the roofs. boards or frozen sealskins were placed over all. Snow was piled up on top and pressed into the joints, and then water was thrown over the structures to make everything firm. The ice was packed down, flat inside, and covered with snow for the dogs, which preferred, however, to sleep outside except when the weather was extraordinarily severe. The tethering of the dogs was a simple matter. The end of a chain was buried about 8 inches in the snow. Some fragments of ice were pressed around it, and a little water poured over all. The icy breath of the Antarctic cemented it in a few moments. 4 dogs which had been ailing were shot. Some of the dogs were suffering badly from worms. The remedies at our disposal, unfortunately, were not effective. All the fit dogs were being exercised in the sledges, and they took to the work with enthusiasm. Sometimes their eagerness to be off and away produced laughable results, but the drivers learned to be alert. The wireless apparatus was still rigged, but we listened in vain for the Saturday night time signals from New Year Island, ordered for our benefit by the Argentine government. On Sunday the 28th, Hudson waited at 2 a.m. for the Port Stanley monthly signals, but could hear nothing. Evidently the distances were too great for our small plant. End of Chapter 2, Part 2.
Chapter 3, Part 1 of South. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. South. The Story of Shackleton's Last Expedition, 1914 through 1917. By Sir Ernest Shackleton. Chapter 3, Part 1. Winter Months. The month of March opened with a severe northeasterly gale. 5 Weddells and 2 crab-eaters were shot on the floe during the morning of March 1st, and the wind, with fine drifting snow, sprang up while the carcasses were being brought in by sledging parties. The men were compelled to abandon some of the blubber and meat, and they had a struggle to get back to the ship over the rough ice in the teeth of the storm. This gale continued until the 3rd, and all hands were employed clearing out the 'tween decks, which was to be converted into a living and dining room for officers and scientists. The carpenter erected in this room the stove that had been intended for use in the shore hut, and the quarters were made very snug. The dogs appeared indifferent to the blizzard. They emerged occasionally from the drift to shake themselves and bark, but were content most of the time to lie curled into tight balls under the snow. One of the old dogs, Saint, died on the night of the 2nd, and the doctors reported that the cause of death was appendicitis. When the gale cleared, we found that the pack had been driven in from the northeast and was now more firmly consolidated than before. A new berg, probably 15 miles in length, had appeared on the northern horizon. The bergs within our circle of vision had all become familiar objects, and we had names for some of them. Apparently they were all drifting with the pack. The sighting of a new berg was of more than passing interest, since in that comparatively shallow sea it would be possible for a big berg to become stranded. Then the island of ice would be a center of tremendous pressure and disturbance amid the drifting pack. We had seen something already of the smashing effect of a contest between berg and floe, and had no wish to have the helpless endurance involved in such a battle of giants. During the 3rd, the seal meat and blubber was restowed on hummocks around the ship. The frozen masses had been sinking into the floe. Ice, though hard and solid to the touch, is never firm against heavy weights. An article left on the floe for any length of time is likely to sink into the surface ice. Then the salt water will percolate through, and the article will become frozen into the body of the floe. Clear weather followed the gale, and we had a series of mock suns and parhelia. Minus temperatures were the rule, 21 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit being recorded on the 6th. We made mattresses for the dogs by stuffing sacks with straw and rubbish, and most of the animals were glad to receive this furnishing in their kennels. Some of them had suffered through the snow melting with the heat of their bodies and then freezing solid. The scientific members of the expedition were all busy by this time. The meteorologist had got his recording station, containing anemometer, barograph, and thermograph, rigged over the stern. The geologist was making the best of what to him was an unhappy situation, but was not altogether without material. The pebbles found in the penguins were often of considerable interest, and some fragments of rock were brought up from the sea floor with the sounding lead and the drag net. On the 7th, Wordie and Worsley found some small pebbles, a piece of moss, a perfect bivalve shell, and some dust on a berg fragment, and brought their treasure trove proudly to the ship. Clark was using the dragnet frequently in the leads and secured good hauls of plankton, with occasional specimens of greater scientific interest. Seals were not plentiful, but our store of meat and blubber grew gradually. All hands ate seal meat with relish, and would not have cared to become dependent on the ship's tinned meat. We preferred the crab-eater to the Weddell, which is a very sluggish beast. The crab-eater was cleaner and healthier. The killer whales were still with us. On the 8th we examined a spot where the floe ice had been smashed up by a blow from beneath, delivered presumably by a large whale in search of a breathing place. The force that had been exercised was astonishing. Slabs of ice 3 feet thick and weighing tons had been tented upwards over a circular area with a diameter of about 25 feet, and cracks radiated outwards for more than 20 feet. The quarters in the 'tween decks were completed by the 10th, and the men took possession of the cubicles that had been built. The largest cubicle contained Macklin, McElroy, Hurley, and Hussey, and it was named the Billabong. Clark and Wordie lived opposite in a room called Auld Reekie. Next came the abode of the Nuts, or engineers, followed by the Sailors' Rest, inhabited by Cheetham and McNeish. The anchorage and the fumarole were on the other side. The new quarters became known as the Ritz, and meals were served there instead of in the wardroom. Breakfast was at 9 a.m., lunch at 1 p.m., tea at 4 p.m., and dinner at 6 p.m. Wild, Marston, Crean, and Worsley established themselves in cubicles in the wardroom, and by the middle of the month all hands had settled down to the winter routine. I lived alone, aft. Worsley, Hurley, and Wordie made a journey to a big berg, called by us the Rampart Berg, on the 11th. The distance out was 7½ miles, and the party covered a total distance of about 17 miles. Hurley took some photographs, and Wordie came back rejoicing with a little dust and some moss. Within a radius of 1 mile around the berg there is thin young ice, strong enough to march over with care, wrote Worsley. The area of dangerous pressure, as regards a ship, does not seem to extend for more than 1/4 mile from the berg. Here there are cracks and constant slight movement, which becomes exciting to the traveler when he feels a piece of ice gradually upending beneath his feet. Close to the berg the pressure makes all sorts of quaint noises. We heard tapping as from a hammer, grunts, groans, and squeaks, electric trams running, birds singing, kettles boiling noisily, and an occasional swish as a large piece of ice, released from pressure, suddenly jumped or turned over. We noticed all sorts of quaint effects, such as huge bubbles or domes of ice 40 feet across and 4 or 5 feet high. Large, sinuous pancake sheets were spread over the floe in places, and in one spot we counted 5 such sheets, each about 2½ inches thick, imbricated under one another. They looked as though made of barley sugar and are very slippery. The noon position on the 14th was latitude 76 degrees 54 minutes south, longitude 36 degrees 10 minutes west. The land was visible faintly to the southeast, distant about 36 miles. A few small leads could be seen from the ship, but the ice was firm in our neighborhood. The drift of the Endurance was still towards the northwest. I had the boilers blown down on the 15th, and the consumption of 200 weight of coal per day to keep the boilers from freezing then ceased. The bunker still contained 52 tons of coal, and the daily consumption in the stoves was about 2½ hundredweight. There would not be much coal left for steaming purposes in the spring, but I anticipated eking out the supply with blubber. A moderate gale from the northeast on the 17th brought fine, penetrating snow. The weather cleared in the evening, and a beautiful crimson sunset held our eyes. At the same time, the ice cliffs of the land were thrown up in the sky by mirage, with an apparent reflection in open water, though the land itself could not be seen definitely. The effect was repeated in an exaggerated form on the following day, when the ice cliffs were thrown up above the horizon in double and treble parallel lines, some inverted. The mirage was due probably to lanes of open water near the land. The water would be about 30 degrees warmer than the air and would cause warm strata to ascend. A sounding gave 606 fathoms, with a bottom of glacial mud. 6 days later, on the 24th, the depth was 419 fathoms. We were drifting steadily, and the constant movement, coupled with the appearance of lanes near the land, convinced me that we must stay by the ship till she got clear. I had considered the possibility of making a landing across the ice in the spring, but the hazards of such an undertaking would be too great. The training of the dogs in sledge teams was making progress. The orders used by the drivers were mush, go on, gee, right, haw, left, and whoa, stop. These are the words that the Canadian drivers long ago adopted, borrowing them originally from England. There were many fights at first, until the dogs learned their positions and their duties. But as days passed, drivers and teams became efficient. Each team had its leader, and efficiency depended largely on the willingness and ability of this dog to punish skulking and disobedience. We learned not to interfere unless the disciplinary measures threatened to have a fatal termination. The drivers could sit on the sledge and jog along at ease if they chose. But the prevailing minus temperatures made riding unpopular, and the men preferred usually to run or walk alongside the teams. We were still losing dogs through sickness, due to stomach and intestinal worms. Dredging for specimens at various depths was one of the duties during these days. The dredge and several hundred fathoms of wire line made a heavy load, far beyond the unaided strength of the scientists. On the 23rd, for example, we put down a 2-foot dredge and 650 fathoms of wire. The dredge was hove in 4 hours later, and brought much glacial mud, several pebbles and rock fragments, 3 sponges, some worms, brachiopods, and foraminiferae. The mud was troublesome. It was heavy to lift, and as it froze rapidly when brought to the surface, the recovery of specimens embedded in it was difficult. A haul made on the 26th brought a prize for the geologist in the form of a lump of sandstone weighing 75 pounds, a piece of fossiliferous limestone, a fragment of striated shale, sandstone grit, and some pebbles. Hauling in the dredge by hand was severe work, and on the 24th we used the Girling tractor motor, which brought in 500 fathoms of line in 30 minutes, including stops. One stop was due to water having run over the friction gear and frozen. It was a day or two later that we heard a great yell from the floe, and found Clark dancing about and shouting Scottish war cries. He had secured his first complete specimen of an Antarctic fish, apparently a new species. Mirages were frequent. Barrier cliffs appeared all around us on the 29th, even in places where we knew there was deep water. Bergs and pack are thrown up in the sky and distorted into the most fantastic shapes. They climb, trembling, upwards, spreading out into long lines at different levels, then contract and fall down, leaving nothing but an uncertain, wavering smudge, which comes and goes. Presently the smudge swells and grows, taking shape until it presents the perfect, inverted reflection of a berg on the horizon, the shadow hovering over the substance. More smudges appear at different points on the horizon. These spread out into long lines till they meet, and we are girdled by lines of shining snow cliffs, laved at their bases by water of illusion in which they appear to be faithfully reflected. So the shadows come and go silently, melting away finally as the sun declines to the west. We seem to be drifting helplessly in a strange world of unreality. It is reassuring to feel the ship beneath one's feet and to look down at the familiar line of kennels and igloos on the solid floe. The floe was not so solid as it appeared. We had reminders occasionally that the greedy sea was very close, and that the floe was but a treacherous friend, which might open suddenly beneath us. Towards the end of the month I had our store of seal meat and blubber brought aboard. The depth as recorded by a sounding on the last day of March was 256 fathoms. The continuous shoaling from 606 fathoms in a drift of 39 miles north, 26 degrees west, in 30 days was interesting. The sea shoaled as we went north, either to east or to west, and the fact suggested that the contour lines ran east and west, roughly. Our total drift between January 19th, when the ship was frozen in, and March 31st, a period of 71 days, had been 95 miles in a north 80 degrees west direction. The icebergs around us had not changed their relative positions. The sun sank lower in the sky, the temperatures became lower, and the Endurance felt the grip of the icy hand of winter. 2 northeasterly gales in the early part of April assisted to consolidate the pack. The young ice was thickening rapidly, and though leads were visible occasionally from the ship, no opening of a considerable size appeared in our neighborhood. In the early morning of April 1st, we listened again for the wireless signals from Port Stanley. The crew had lashed 3 20-foot rickers to the mastheads in order to increase the spread of our aerials, but still we failed to hear anything. The rickers had to come down subsequently, since we found that the gear could not carry the accumulating weight of rime. Soundings proved that the sea continued to shoal as the Endurance drifted to the northwest. The depth on April 2nd was 262 fathoms, with a bottom of glacial mud. 4 weeks later, a sounding gave 172 fathoms. The presence of grit in the bottom samples towards the end of the month suggested that we were approaching land again. The month was not uneventful. During the night of the 3rd, we heard the ice grinding to the eastward, and in the morning we saw that young ice was rafted 8 to 10 feet high in places. This was the first murmur of the danger that was to reach menacing proportions in later months. The ice was heard grinding and creaking during the 4th, and the ship vibrated slightly. The movement of the floe was sufficiently pronounced to interfere with the magnetic work. I gave orders that accumulations of snow, ice, and rubbish alongside the Endurance should be shoveled away, so that in case of pressure there would be no weight against the topsides to check the ship rising above the ice. All hands were busy with pick and shovel during the day, and moved many tons of material. Again on the 9th there were signs of pressure. Young ice was piled up to a height of 11 feet astern of the ship, and the old floe was cracked in places. The movement was not serious, but I realized that it might be the beginning of trouble for the expedition. We brought certain stores aboard, and provided space on deck for the dogs in case they had to be removed from the floe at short notice. We had run a 500-fathom steel wire round the ship, snow huts, and kennels, with a loop out to the lead ahead where the dredge was used. This wire was supported on ice pillars, and it served as a guide in bad weather when the view was obscured by driving snow and a man might have lost himself altogether. I had this wire cut in 5 places, since otherwise it might have been dragged across our section of the floe with damaging effect in the event of the ice splitting suddenly. The dogs had been divided into 6 teams of 9 dogs each. Wild, Crean, Macklin, McElroy, Marston, and Hurley each had charge of a team, and were fully responsible for the exercising, training, and feeding of their own dogs. They called in one of the surgeons when an animal was sick. We were still losing some dogs through worms, and it was unfortunate that the doctors had not the proper remedies. Worm powders were to have been provided by the expert Canadian dog driver I had engaged before sailing for the South, and when this man did not join the expedition, the matter was overlooked. We had 54 dogs and 8 pups early in April, but several were ailing, and the number of mature dogs was reduced to 50 by the end of the month. Our store of seal meat amounted now to about 5,000 pounds, and I calculated that we had enough meat and blubber to feed the dogs for 90 days without trenching upon the sledging rations. The teams were working well, often with heavy loads. The biggest dog was Hercules, who tipped the beam at 86 pounds. Samson was 11 pounds lighter, but he justified his name one day by starting off at a smart pace with a sledge carrying 200 pounds of blubber and a driver. A new berg that was going to give us some cause for anxiety made its appearance on the 14th. It was a big berg, and we noticed as it lay on the northwest horizon that it had a hummocky, creviced appearance at the east end. During the day this berg increased its apparent altitude and changed its bearing slightly. Evidently it was aground and was holding its position against the drifting pack. A sounding at 11 a.m. gave 197 fathoms, with a hard stony or rocky bottom. During the next 24 hours the Endurance moved steadily towards the creviced berg, which doubled its altitude in that time. We could see from the masthead that the pack was piling and rafting against the mass of ice, and it was easy to imagine what would be the fate of the ship if she entered the area of disturbance. She would be crushed like an eggshell amid the shattering masses. Worsley was in the crow's nest on the evening of the 15th, watching for signs of land to the westward, and he reported an interesting phenomenon. The sun set amid a glow of prismatic colors on a line of clouds just above the horizon. A minute later Worsley saw a golden glow, which expanded as he watched it, and presently the sun appeared again and rose to a semi-diameter clear above the western horizon. He hailed Crean, who from a position on the floe 90 feet below the crow's nest also saw the reborn sun. A quarter of an hour later from the deck, Worsley saw the sun set a second time. This strange phenomenon was due to mirage or refraction. We attributed it to an ice crack to the westward, where the band of open water had heated a stratum of air. The drift of the pack was not constant, and during the succeeding days the creviced berg alternately advanced and receded as the Endurance moved with the flow. On Sunday, April 18th, it was only 7 miles distant from the ship. It is a large berg, about 3/4 of a mile long on the side presented to us, and probably well over 200 feet high. It is heavily creviced, as though it once formed the sérac portion of a glacier. Two specially wide and deep chasms across it from southeast to northwest give it the appearance of having broken its back on the shoal ground. Huge masses of pressure ice are piled against its cliffs to a height of about 60 feet, showing the stupendous force that is being brought to bear upon it by the drifting pack. The berg must be very firmly aground. We swing the arrow on the current meter frequently, and watch with keen attention to see where it will come to rest. Will it point straight for the berg, showing that our drift is in that direction? It swings slowly round. It points to the northeast end of the berg, then shifts slowly to the center and seems to stop. But it moves again and swings 20 degrees clear of our enemy to the southwest. We notice that two familiar bergs, the Rampart Berg and the Peak Berg, have moved away from the ship. Probably they also have grounded or dragged on the shoal. A strong drift to the westward during the night of the 18th relieved our anxiety by carrying the Endurance to the lee of the creviced berg, which passed out of our range of vision before the end of the month. We said goodbye to the sun on May 1st, and entered the period of twilight that would be followed by the darkness of midwinter. The sun, by the aid of refraction, just cleared the horizon at noon and set shortly before 2 p.m. A fine aurora in the evening was dimmed by the full moon, which had risen on April 27th, and would not set again until May 6th. The disappearance of the sun is apt to be a depressing event in the polar regions, where the long months of darkness involve mental as well as physical strain. But the Endurance's company refused to abandon their customary cheerfulness, and a concert in the evening made the Ritz a scene of noisy merriment, in strange contrast with the cold, silent world that lay outside. One feels our helplessness as the long winter night closes upon us. By this time, if fortune had smiled upon the expedition, we would have been comfortably and securely established in a shore base, with depots laid to the south and plans made for the long march in the spring and summer. Where will we make a landing now? It is not easy to forecast the future. The ice may open in the spring, but by that time we will be far to the northwest. I do not think we shall be able to work back to Vosel Bay. There are possible landing places on the western coast of the Weddell Sea, but can we reach any suitable spot early enough to attempt the overland journey next year? Time alone will tell. I do not think any member of the expedition is disheartened by our disappointment. All hands are cheery and busy, and will do their best when the time for action comes. In the meantime, we must wait. The ship's position on Sunday, May 2nd, was latitude 75 degrees 23 minutes south, longitude 42 degrees 14 minutes west. The temperature at noon was 5 degrees below zero Fahrenheit, and the sky was overcast. A seal was sighted from the masthead at lunchtime, and 5 men with 2 dog teams set off after the prize. They had an uncomfortable journey outward in the dim, diffused light, which cast no shadows and gave no warning of irregularities in the white surface. It is a strange sensation to be running along on apparently smooth snow and to fall suddenly into an unseen hollow or bump against a ridge. After going out 3 miles to the eastward, wrote Worsley, in describing this seal hunt, we range up and down but find nothing, until from a hummock I fancy I see something, apparently a mile away, but probably little more than half that distance. I ran for it, found the seal, and with a shout brought up the others at the double. The seal was a big Weddell, over 10 feet long and weighing more than 800 pounds. But Soldier, one of the team leaders, went for its throat without a moment's hesitation, and we had to beat off the dogs before we could shoot the seal. We caught 5 or 6 gallons of blood in a tin for the dogs, and let the teams have a drink of fresh blood from the seal. The light was worse than ever on our return, and we arrived back in the dark. Sir Ernest met us with a lantern, and guided us into the lead astern and thence to the ship. This was the first seal we had secured since March 19th, and the meat and blubber made a welcome addition to the stores. 3 emperor penguins made their appearance in the lead west of the ship on May 3rd. They pushed their heads through the young ice while 2 of the men were standing by the lead. The men imitated the emperor's call and walked slowly, penguin fashion, away from the lead. The birds in succession made a magnificent leap, 3 feet clear from the water onto the young ice. Thence they tobogganed to the bank and followed the men away from the lead. Their retreat was soon cut off by a line of men. We walked up to them, talking loudly and assuming a threatening aspect. Notwithstanding our bad manners, the 3 birds turned toward us, bowing ceremoniously. Then, after a closer inspection, they conclude that we are undesirable acquaintances and make off across the floe. We head them off and finally shepherd them close to the ship, where the frenzied barking of the dogs so frightens them that they make a determined effort to break through the line. We seize them. One bird of philosophic mien goes quietly, led by one flipper. The others show fight, but all are imprisoned in an igloo for the night. In the afternoon we see 5 emperors in the western lead and capture 1. Kerr and Cheetham fight a valiant action with 2 large birds. Kerr rushes at one, seizes it, and is promptly knocked down by the angered penguin, which jumps on his chest before retiring. Cheetham comes to Kerr's assistance, and between them they seize another penguin, bind his bill, and lead him, muttering muffled protests, to the ship like an inebriated old man between 2 policemen. He weighs 85 pounds, or 5 pounds less than the heaviest emperor captured previously. Kerr and Cheetham insist that he is nothing to the big fellow who escaped them. This penguin's stomach proved to be filled with freshly caught fish up to 10 inches long. Some of the fish were of a coastal or littoral variety. 2 more emperors were captured on the following day, and while Wardy was leading one of them towards the ship, Wild came along with his team. The dogs, uncontrollable in a moment, made a frantic rush for the bird, and were almost upon him when their harness caught upon an ice pylon, which they had tried to pass on both sides at once. The result was a seething tangle of dogs, traces, and men, and an overturned sled, while the penguin, 3 yards away, nonchalantly and indifferently surveyed the disturbance. He had never seen anything of the kind before, and had no idea at all that the strange disorder might concern him. Several cracks had opened in the neighborhood of the ship, and the emperor penguins, fat and glossy of plumage, were appearing in considerable numbers. We secured 9 of them on May 6th, an important addition to our supply of fresh food. The sun, which had made positively his last appearance, 7 days earlier, surprised us by lifting more than half its disk above the horizon on May 8th. A glow on the northern horizon resolved itself into the sun at 11 a.m. that day. A quarter of an hour later the unseasonable visitor disappeared again, only to rise again at 11:40 a.m., set at 1 p.m., rise at 1:10 p.m., and set lingeringly at 1:20 p.m. These curious phenomena were due to refraction, which amounted to 2 degrees 37 minutes at 1:20 p.m. The temperature was 15 degrees below zero Fahrenheit, and we calculated that the refraction was 2 degrees above normal. In other words, the sun was visible 120 miles farther south than the refraction tables give it any right to be. The navigating officer naturally was aggrieved. He had informed all hands on May 1st that they would not see the sun again for 70 days, and now had to endure the jeers of friends who affected to believe that his observations were inaccurate by a few degrees. The Endurance was drifting north-northeast under the influence of a succession of westerly and southwesterly breezes. The ship's head, at the same time, swung gradually to the left, indicating that the flow in which she was held was turning. During the night of the 14th a very pronounced swing occurred, and when daylight came at noon on the 15th, we observed a large lead running from the northwest horizon towards the ship till it struck the western lead, circling ahead of the ship, then continuing to the south-southeast. A lead astern connected with this new lead on either side of the Endurance, thus separating our flow completely from the main body of the pack. A blizzard from the southeast swept down during the 16th. At 1 p.m. the blizzard lulled for 5 minutes, then the wind jumped round to the opposite quarter and the barometer rose suddenly. The center of a cyclonic movement had passed over us, and the compass recorded an extraordinarily rapid swing of the flow. I could see nothing through the mist and snow, and I thought it possible that a magnetic storm or a patch of local magnetic attraction had caused the compass and not the flow to swing. Our flow was now about 2½ miles long, north and south, and 3 miles wide, east and west. End of Chapter 3, Part 1. Chapter 3, Part 2 of South. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. South. The Story of Shackleton's Last Expedition, 1914 through 1917, by Sir Ernest Shackleton. Chapter 3, Part 2. The month of May passed with few incidents of importance. Hurley, our handyman, installed our small electric lighting plant, and placed lights for occasional use in the observatory, the meteorological station, and various other points. We could not afford to use the electric lamps freely. Hurley also rigged 2 powerful lights on poles, projecting from the ship to port and starboard. These lamps would illuminate the dogloos brilliantly on the darkest winter's day, and would be invaluable in the event of the floe breaking during the dark days of winter. We could imagine what it would mean to get 50 dogs aboard without lights while the floe was breaking and rafting under our feet. May 24th, Empire Day, was celebrated with the singing of patriotic songs in the Ritz, where all hands joined in wishing a speedy victory for the British arms. We could not know how the war was progressing, but we hoped that the Germans had already been driven from France, and that the Russian armies had put the seal on the Allies' success. The war was a constant subject of discussion aboard the Endurance, and many campaigns were fought on the map during the long months of drifting. The moon in the latter part of May was sweeping continuously through our starlit sky in great high circles. The weather generally was good, with constant minus temperatures. The log on May 27th recorded: brilliantly fine clear weather with bright moonlight throughout. The moon's rays are wonderfully strong, making midnight seem as light as an ordinary overcast midday in temperate climes. The great clearness of the atmosphere probably accounts for our having 8 hours of twilight with a beautiful soft golden glow to the northward. A little rime and glazed frost are found aloft. The temperature is -20° Fahrenheit. A few wisps of cirrus clouds are seen, and a little frost smoke shows in 1 or 2 directions, but the cracks and leads near the ship appear to have frozen over again. Crean had started to take the pups out for runs, and it was very amusing to see them with their rolling canter just managing to keep abreast by the sledge, and occasionally cocking an eye with an appealing look in the hope of being taken aboard for a ride. As an addition to their foster father, Crean, the pups had adopted Amundsen. They tyrannized over him most unmercifully. It was a common sight to see him, the biggest dog in the pack, sitting out in the cold with an air of philosophic resignation, while a corpulent pup occupied the entrance to his dogloo. The intruder was generally the pup Nelson, who just showed his forepaws and face, and one was fairly sure to find Nellie, Roger, and Toby coiled up comfortably behind him. At hoosh time, Crean had to stand by Amundsen's food, since otherwise the pups would eat the big dog's ration while he stood back to give them fair play. Sometimes their consciences would smite them, and they would drag around a seal's head, half a penguin, or a large lump of frozen meat or blubber to Amundsen's kennel for rent. It was interesting to watch the big dog play with them, seizing them by throat or neck in what appeared to be a fierce fashion, while really quite gentle with them, and all the time teaching them how to hold their own in the world, and putting them up to all the tricks of dog life. The drift of the Endurance in the grip of the pack continued without incident of importance through June. Pressure was reported occasionally, but the ice in the immediate vicinity of the ship remained firm. The light was now very bad except in the period when the friendly moon was above the horizon. A faint twilight round about noon of each day reminded us of the sun, and assisted us in the important work of exercising the dogs. The care of the teams was our heaviest responsibility in those days. The movement of the floes was beyond all human control, and there was nothing to be gained by allowing one's mind to struggle with the problems of the future, though it was hard to avoid anxiety at times. The conditioning and training of the dogs seemed essential, whatever fate might be in store for us, and the teams were taken out by their drivers whenever the weather permitted. Rivalries arose, as might have been expected, and on the 15th of the month a great race, the Antarctic Derby, took place. It was a notable event. The betting had been heavy, and every man aboard the ship stood to win or lose on the result of the contest. Some money had been staked, but the wagers that thrilled were those involving stores of chocolate and cigarettes. The course had been laid off from Khyber Pass, at the eastern end of the old lead ahead of the ship, to a point clear of the jib boom, a distance of about 700 yards. 5 teams went out in the dim noon twilight, with a 0 temperature and an aurora flickering faintly to the southward. The starting signal was to be given by the flashing of a light on the meteorological station. I was appointed starter, Worsley was judge, and James was timekeeper. The boatswain, with a straw hat added to his usual Antarctic attire, stood on a box near the winning post, and was assisted by a couple of shady characters to shout the odds, which were displayed on a board hung round his neck: 6-4 on Wild, evens on Crean, 2-1 against Hurley, 6-1 against Macklin, and 8-1 against McElroy. Canvas handkerchiefs fluttered from an improvised grandstand, and the pups, which had never seen such strange happenings before, sat round and howled with excitement. The spectators could not see far in the dim light, but they heard the shouts of the drivers as the teams approached, and greeted the victory of the favorite with a roar of cheering that must have sounded strange indeed to any seals or penguins that happened to be in our neighborhood. Wild's time was 2 minutes 16 seconds, or at the rate of 10.5 miles per hour for the course. We celebrated Midwinter's Day on the 22nd. The twilight extended over a period of about 6 hours that day, and there was a good light at noon from the moon, and also a northern glow with wisps of beautiful pink cloud along the horizon. A sounding gave 262 fathoms with a mud bottom. No land was in sight from the masthead, although our range of vision extended probably a full degree to the westward. The day was observed as a holiday, necessary work only being undertaken, and after the best dinner the cook could provide, all hands gathered in the Ritz, where speeches, songs, and toasts occupied the evening. After supper at midnight we sang God Save the King, and wished each other all success in the days of sunshine and effort that lay ahead. At this time the Endurance was making an unusually rapid drift to the north, under the influence of a fresh southerly to southwesterly breeze. We traveled 39 miles to the north in 5 days before a breeze that only once attained the force of a gale, and then for no more than an hour. The absence of strong winds, in comparison with the almost unceasing winter blizzards of the Ross Sea, was a feature of the Weddell Sea that impressed itself upon me during the winter months. Another race took place a few days after the Derby. The 2 crack teams, driven by Hurley and Wild, met in a race from Khyber Pass. Wild's team, pulling 910 pounds, or 130 pounds per dog, covered the 700 yards in 2 minutes 9 seconds, or at the rate of 11.1 miles per hour. Hurley's team, with the same load, did the run in 2 minutes 16 seconds. The race was awarded by the judge to Hurley, owing to Wild failing to weigh in correctly. I happened to be a part of the load on his sledge, and a skid over some new drift within 50 yards of the winning post resulted in my being left on the snow. It should be said in justice to the dogs that this accident, while justifying the disqualification, could not have made any material difference in the time. The approach of the returning sun was indicated by beautiful sunrise glows on the horizon in the early days of July. We had 9 hours twilight on the 10th, and the northern sky low to the horizon was tinted with gold for about 7 hours. Numerous cracks and leads extended in all directions to within 300 yards of the ship. Thin, wavering black lines close to the northern horizon were probably distant leads refracted into the sky. Sounds of moderate pressure came to our ears occasionally, but the ship was not involved. At midnight on the 11th, a crack in the lead ahead of the Endurance opened out rapidly, and by 2 a.m. was over 200 yards wide in places, with an area of open water to the southwest. Sounds of pressure were heard along this lead, which soon closed to a width of about 30 yards and then froze over. The temperature at that time was -23°F. The most severe blizzard we had experienced in the Weddell Sea swept down upon the Endurance on the evening of the 13th, and by breakfast time on the following morning the kennels to the windward or southern side of the ship were buried under 5 feet of drift. I gave orders that no man should venture beyond the kennels. The ship was invisible at a distance of 50 yards, and it was impossible to preserve one's sense of direction in the raging wind and suffocating drift. To walk against the gale was out of the question. Face and eyes became snowed up within 2 minutes, and serious frostbites would have been the penalty of perseverance. The dogs stayed in their kennels for the most part, the old stagers putting out a paw occasionally in order to keep open a breathing hole. By evening the gale had attained a force of 60 or 70 miles an hour, and the ship was trembling under the attack. But we were snug enough in our quarters aboard until the morning of the 14th, when all hands turned out to shovel the snow from deck and kennels. The wind was still keen and searching, with a temperature of something like -30°F, and it was necessary for us to be on guard against frostbite. At least 100 tons of snow were piled against the bows and port side, where the weight of the drift had forced the floe downward. The lead ahead had opened out during the night, cracked the pack from north to south, and frozen over again, adding 300 yards to the distance between the ship and Khyber Pass. The breakdown gang had completed its work by lunchtime. The gale was then decreasing, and the 3-days-old moon showed as a red crescent on the northern horizon. The temperature during the blizzard had ranged from -21° to -33.5°F. It is usual for the temperature to rise during a blizzard, and the failure to produce any Föhn effect of this nature suggested an absence of high land for at least 200 miles to the south and southwest. The weather did not clear until the 16th. We saw then that the appearance of the surrounding pack had been altered completely by the blizzard. The island floe containing the Endurance still stood fast, but cracks and masses of ice thrown up by pressure could be seen in all directions. An area of open water was visible on the horizon to the north, with a water indication in the northern sky. The ice pressure, which was indicated by distant rumblings and the appearance of formidable ridges, was increasingly a cause of anxiety. The areas of disturbance were gradually approaching the ship. During July 21st, we could bear the grinding and crashing of the working floes to the southwest and west, and could see cracks opening, working, and closing ahead. The ice is rafting up to a height of 10 or 15 feet in places. The opposing floes are moving against one another at the rate of about 200 yards per hour. The noise resembles the roar of heavy, distant surf. Standing on the stirring ice, one can imagine it is disturbed by the breathing and tossing of a mighty giant below. Early on the afternoon of the 22nd, a 2-foot crack running southwest and northeast for a distance of about 2 miles approached to within 35 yards of the port quarter. I had all the sledges brought aboard and set a special watch in case it became necessary to get the dogs off the floe in a hurry. This crack was the result of heavy pressure 300 yards away on the port bow, where huge blocks of ice were piled up in wild and threatening confusion. The pressure at that point was enormous. Blocks weighing many tons were raised 15 feet above the level of the floe. I arranged to divide the night watches with Worsley and Wild, and none of us had much rest. The ship was shaken by heavy bumps, and we were on the alert to see that no dogs had fallen into cracks. The morning light showed that our island had been reduced considerably during the night. Our long months of rest and safety seemed to be at an end, and a period of stress had begun. During the following day I had a store of sledging provisions, oil, matches, and other essentials placed on the upper deck handy to the starboard quarter boat, so as to be in readiness for a sudden emergency. The ice was grinding and working steadily to the southward, and in the evening some large cracks appeared on the port quarter, while a crack alongside opened out to 15 yards. The blizzard seemed to have set the ice in strong movement towards the north, and the southwesterly and west-southwesterly winds that prevailed 2 days out of 3 maintained the drift. I hoped that this would continue unchecked, since our chance of getting clear of the pack early in the spring appeared to depend upon our making a good northing. Soundings at this time gave depths of from 186 to 190 fathoms, with a glacial mud bottom. No land was in sight. The light was improving. A great deal of ice pressure was heard and observed in all directions during the 25th, much of it close to the port quarter of the ship. On the starboard bow, huge blocks of ice, weighing many tons and 5 feet in thickness, were pushed up on the old floe to a height of 15 to 20 feet. The floe that held the Endurance was swung to and fro by the pressure during the day, but came back to the old bearing before midnight. The ice for miles around is much looser. There are numerous cracks and short leads to the northeast and southeast. Ridges are being forced up in all directions, and there is a water sky to the southeast. It would be a relief to be able to make some effort on our own behalf, but we can do nothing until the ice releases our ship. If the floes continue to loosen, we may break out within the next few weeks and resume the fight. In the meantime, the pressure continues, and it is hard to foresee the outcome. Just before noon today, July 26th, the top of the sun appeared by refraction for 1 minute, 79 days after our last sunset. A few minutes earlier, a small patch of the sun had been thrown up on one of the black streaks above the horizon. All hands are cheered by the indication that the end of the winter darkness is near. Clark finds that with returning daylight, the diatoms are again appearing. His nets and line are stained a pale yellow, and much of the newly formed ice has also a faint brown or yellow tinge. The diatoms cannot multiply without light, and the ice formed since February can be distinguished in the pressure ridges by its clear blue color. The older masses of ice are of a dark, earthy brown, dull yellow, or reddish brown. The breakup of our floe came suddenly on Sunday, August 1st, just 1 year after the Endurance left the Southwest India docks on the voyage to the far south. The position was latitude 72 degrees 26 minutes south, longitude 48 degrees 10 minutes west. The morning brought a moderate southwesterly gale with heavy snow, and at 8 a.m., after some morning movements of the ice, the floe cracked 40 yards off the starboard bow. 2 hours later, the floe began to break up all around us under pressure, and the ship listed over 10 degrees to starboard. I had the dogs and sledges brought aboard at once, and the gangway hoisted. The animals behaved well. They came aboard eagerly, as though realizing their danger, and were placed in their quarters on deck without a single fight occurring. The pressure was cracking the floe rapidly, rafting it close to the slip, and forcing masses of ice beneath the keel. Presently the Endurance listed heavily to port against the gale, and at the same time was forced ahead, astern, and sideways several times by the grinding floes. She received 1 or 2 hard nips, but resisted them without as much as a creak. It looked at one stage as if the ship was to be made the plaything of successive floes, and I was relieved when she came to a standstill with a large piece of our old dock under the starboard bilge. I had the boats cleared away ready for lowering, and got up some additional stores, and set a double watch. All hands were warned to stand by, get what sleep they could, and have their warmest clothing at hand. Around us lay the ruins of Dogtown, amid the debris of pressure ridges. Some of the little dwellings had been crushed flat beneath blocks of ice. Others had been swallowed and pulverized when the ice opened beneath them and closed again. It was a sad sight, but my chief concern just then was the safety of the rudder, which was being attacked viciously by the ice. We managed to pull away a large lump that had become jammed between the rudder and the stern post, but I could see that damage had been done, though a close examination was not possible that day. After the ship had come to a standstill in her new position, very heavy pressure was set up. Some of the trenails were started, and the beams buckled slightly under the terrific stresses. but the Endurance had been built to withstand the attacks of the ice, and she lifted bravely as the floes drove beneath her. The effects of the pressure around us were awe-inspiring. Mighty blocks of ice, gripped between meeting floes, rose slowly till they jumped like cherry stones squeezed between thumb and finger. The pressure of millions of tons of moving ice was crushing and smashing inexorably. If the ship was once gripped firmly, her fate would be sealed. The gale from the southwest blew all night and moderated during the afternoon of the 2nd to a stiff breeze. The pressure had almost ceased. Apparently the gale had driven the southern pack down upon us, causing congestion in our area. The pressure had stopped when the whole of the pack got into motion. The gale had given us some northing, but it had dealt the Endurance what might prove to be a severe blow. The rudder had been driven hard over to starboard, and the blade partially torn away from the rudder head. Heavy masses of ice were still jammed against the stern, and it was impossible to ascertain the extent of the damage at that time. I felt that it would be impossible in any case to effect repairs in the moving pack. The ship lay steady all night, and the sole sign of continuing pressure was an occasional slight rumbling shock. We rigged shelters and kennels for the dogs inboard. The weather on August 3rd was overcast and misty. We had 9 hours of twilight, with good light at noon. There was no land in sight for 10 miles from the masthead. The pack, as far as the eye could reach, was in a condition of chaos, much rafted and consolidated, with very large pressure ridges in all directions. At 9 p.m. a rough altitude of Canopus gave the latitude at 71 degrees 55 minutes 17 seconds south. The drift, therefore, had been about 37 miles to the north in 3 days. 4 of the poorest dogs were shot this day. They were suffering severely from worms, and we could not afford to keep sick dogs under the changed conditions. The sun showed through the clouds on the northern horizon for an hour on the 4th. There was no open water to be seen from aloft in any direction. We saw from the masthead to west-southwest an appearance of barrier, land, or a very long iceberg about 20 odd miles away, but the horizon clouded over before we could determine its nature. We tried twice to make a sounding that day, but failed on each occasion. The Kelvin machine gave no bottom at the full length of the line, 370 fathoms. After much labor, we made a hole in the ice near the stern post large enough for the Lucas machine with a 32-pound lead, but this appeared to be too light. The machine stopped at 452 fathoms, leaving us in doubt as to whether the bottom had been reached. Then, in heaving up, we lost the lead, the thin wire cutting its way into the ice and snapping. All hands and the carpenter were busy this day, making and placing kennels on the upper deck, and by nightfall all the dogs were comfortably housed, ready for any weather. The sun showed through the clouds above the northern horizon for nearly an hour. The remaining days of August were comparatively uneventful. The ice around the ship froze firm again, and little movement occurred in our neighborhood. The training of the dogs, including the puppies, proceeded actively, and provided exercise as well as occupation. The drift to the northwest continued steadily. We had bad luck with soundings, the weather interfering at times, and the gear breaking on several occasions, but a big increase in the depth showed that we had passed over the edge of the Weddell Sea Plateau. A sounding of about 1,700 fathoms on August 10th agreed fairly well with Filchner's 1,924 fathoms, 130 miles east of our then position. An observation at noon of the 8th had given us latitude 71 degrees 23 minutes south, longitude 49 degrees 13 minutes west. Minus temperatures prevailed still, but the daylight was increasing. We captured a few emperor penguins which were making their way to the southwest. 10 penguins taken on the 19th were all in poor condition, and their stomachs contained nothing but stones and a few cuttlefish beaks. A sounding on the 17th gave 1,676 fathoms, 10 miles west of the charted position of Morel Land. No land could be seen from the masthead, and I decided that Morel Land must be added to the long list of Antarctic islands and continental coasts that on close investigation have resolved themselves into icebergs. On clear days we could get an extended view in all directions from the masthead, and the line of the pack was broken only by familiar bergs. About 100 bergs were in view on a fine day, and they seemed practically the same as when they started their drift with us nearly 7 months earlier. The scientists wished to inspect some of the neighboring bergs at close quarters, but sledge traveling outside the well-trodden area immediately around the ship proved difficult and occasionally dangerous. On August 20th, for example, Worsley, Hurley, and Greenstreet started off for the Rampart Berg and got onto a lead of young ice that undulated perilously beneath their feet. A quick turn saved them. A wonderful mirage of the Fata Morgana type was visible on August 20th. The day was clear and bright, with a blue sky overhead and some rime aloft. The distant pack is thrown up into towering, barrier-like cliffs, which are reflected in blue lakes and lanes of water at their base. Great white and golden cities of oriental appearance at close intervals along these cliff tops indicate distant bergs, some not previously known to us. Floating above these are wavering violet and creamy lines of still more remote bergs and pack. The lines rise and fall, tremble, dissipate, and reappear in an endless transformation scene. The southern pack and bergs catching the sun's rays are golden, but to the north the ice masses are purple. Here the bergs assume changing forms, first a castle, then a balloon just clear of the horizon, that changes swiftly into an immense mushroom, a mosque, or a cathedral. The principal characteristic is the vertical lengthening of the object, a small pressure ridge being given the appearance of a line of battlements or towering cliffs. The mirage is produced by refraction and is intensified by the columns of comparatively warm air rising from several cracks and leads that have opened 8 to 20 miles away, north and south. We noticed this day that a considerable change had taken place in our position relative to the Rampart Berg. It appeared that a big lead had opened, and that there had been some differential movement of the pack. The opening movement might presage renewed pressure. A few hours later, the dog teams, returning from exercise, crossed a narrow crack that had appeared ahead of the ship. This crack opened quickly to 60 feet, and would have given us trouble if the dogs had been left on the wrong side. It closed on the 25th, and pressure followed in its neighborhood. On August 24th we were 2 miles north of the latitude of Morell's farthest south, and over 10 degrees of longitude, or more than 200 miles, west of his position. From the masthead no land could be seen within 20 miles, and no land over 500 feet altitude could have escaped observation on our side of longitude 52 degrees west. A sounding of 1,900 fathoms on August 25th was further evidence of the non-existence of New South Greenland. There was some movement of the ice near the ship during the concluding days of the month. All hands were called out in the night of August 26th, sounds of pressure having been followed by the cracking of the ice alongside the ship, but the trouble did not develop immediately. Late on the night of the 31st, the ice began to work ahead of the ship and along the port side. Creaking and groaning of timbers, accompanied by loud snapping sounds fore and aft, told their story of strain. The pressure continued during the following day, beams and deck planks occasionally buckling to the strain. The ponderous floes were grinding against each other under the influence of wind and current, and our ship seemed to occupy for the time being an undesirable position near the center of the disturbance. But she resisted staunchly and showed no sign of water in the bilges, although she had not been pumped out for 6 months. The pack extended to the horizon in every direction. I calculated that we were 250 miles from the nearest known land to the westward, and more than 500 miles from the nearest outpost of civilization, Wilhelmina Bay. I hoped we would not have to undertake a march across the moving ice fields. The Endurance we knew to be stout and true, but no ship ever built by man could live if taken fairly in the grip of the floes and prevented from rising to the surface of the grinding ice. These were anxious days. In the early morning of September 2nd, the ship jumped and shook to the accompaniment of cracks and groans, and some of the men who had been in the berths hurried on deck. The pressure eased a little later in the day, when the ice on the port side broke away from the ship to just abaft the main rigging. The Endurance was still held aft and at the rudder, and a large mass of ice could be seen adhering to the port bow, rising to within 3 feet of the surface. I wondered if this ice had got its grip by piercing the sheathing. End of chapter 3.